Hey there, DC fans. Let's, talk about you for a bit. I know. I've given a lot of love to Marvel, but it's about time we talked about the other side of the fence. And what better time than the dawning of a new DCU? Prior to 2008, the movie landscape between Marvel and DC seemed fairly even. There may have been more consistent Marvel outputs like Spider-Man and the X-Men, but DC seemed to rule the roost when it came to a little more grounded fare, if not a little more streamlined. But in 2008, something no one predicted happened. Marvel changed the landscape of cinema and introduced the idea of a cinematic universe to the mainstream. They weren't the first to do it, but they were the first to do it with the sheer scale and scope that they did. This MCU created a goldmine for the studio and had other studios clamouring to get a piece of the pie. Universal tried something in the manner of a horror universe that sadly whimpered out in their initial foray. Meanwhile, DC, who did have great brand recognition, saw their opportunity to jump into the fray. Unfortunately for them, it wasn't until 2013 that Man of Steel hit the screens, being their first DCEU story. At this point, the MCU had completed its first phase, culminating in the Avengers, and was seemingly untouchable. And while Marvel went from strength to strength, DC fought to keep up. Wanting to match their counterparts, they made massive missteps, attempting to jump past origin stories in order to try to match Marvel where they stood. One thing I did personally appreciate was the attempt to make a darker, more mature universe for DC, something that they have managed to achieve in their comic universe. However, a lack of direction and failure to commit led them down a strange path. Batman vs Superman failed to make the required impact on audiences, with Snyder's style of, let's call it, substance, hinging the movie on a contrivance that I'm sure they thought was going to be deep and meaningful at the time. Despite some good scenes and great casting, the DCEU never really managed to bring it back. For every triumph, there was another misstep. Finally, they called it a day and put a proverbial gun to the head of the DCEU. In many ways it was a shame. There was actually a lot to love about the DCEU. Wonder Woman mainly understood the assignment, and the Snyder Cut of the Justice League produced a serviceable competitor to the Avengers. But for me, they only really started to find their feet when James Gunn took a shot at the Suicide Squad. And that's worth looking at for a moment. DC had produced a Suicide Squad movie already. A terrible movie with a fantastic trailer. The funny thing about this is that no one asked for the Suicide Squad. Hell, at this point, they were still trying to get their core main stories and heroes right. And here were DC trying to reproduce the success of the Guardians of the Galaxy. Suicide Squad ended up another complete misfire for DC, and who came to fix it for them? The man they were trying to impersonate in the first place. And this is where Gunn tends to excel. In the story of the underdog, the weird and wonderful. Gunn's Suicide Squad understood the assignment. It was weird and wacky while being dark, funny, and languishing in gore. Gunn understood immediately what DC had been struggling to put together. He only added to this crazy corner of the DC universe with Peacemaker, a show that took the premise and ran with it. Crazier, darker, and even more twisted. It was a gem that added itself into the pantheon of premier TV entertainment, keeping step with shows like The Boys, House of Dragon, Fallout, and The Last of Us. And just as it looked like the DCEU was about to find their feet, it was over. The DCEU was dead. But equally crazy, emerging from the husk that happened to be the DC's attempt to create a cinematic universe, they finally found an artist that might be able to give their universe a single vision. Someone that might even rival Faye. And here we are, ending 2024, with one of the most watched trailers ever, from one of the most divisive creators ever. Ignoring Creature Commandos for a moment, Gunn has announced to the world that he's here, and for better or worse, his vision will be the vision of DC. And everything about this announcement is screaming at us. From the chosen hero, the place the universe begins, to the colourful cast of supporting characters. Warner Brothers are pinning a lot of hopes on the DC brand, and that's what the trailer seems to stand for. Hope. Whereas the DCEU's themes of God and monsters focused on larger-than-life aspects of the superheroes and the idea of the saviour complex, what we may be, and hopefully are looking at here, will be a lighter tone, with more heroic themes like fighting despite adversity, helping the needy, and saving the vulnerable. Gunn's prior work has often tended towards a darker, comedic tone, irreverent and borders on the line between tasteful and cynical. Personally, I'm a big fan of these movies. But is an entire cinematic universe something to pin this on? Thankfully, the Guardians movies prove that he was able to tell more wholesome stories, in that case of unconventional families. And it's clearly his success here as the reason why Warner Brothers picked him to head up the DC studio. It's interesting that DC have felt very unfocused over the years. Between the DCEU, CW shows, animated movies, animated shows, not to mention other movies unconnected with the universe. I feel like their big problem is that they've diluted their brand in many ways. Marvel were at their best during their first 3 phases, when their stories were self-contained but with a single overall threat. In the 4th and 5th phases, they've expanded that focus to multiverses, post-blip politics, celestial gods, and the realization that women exist. In such disarray, now would be the time to strike, to give people something new and fresh. This trailer puts me in 2 minds. On the one hand, seeing Guy Gardner, Mr. Terrific and Hawkgirl appear gives me a sense of hell yeah. The idea of going through another round of origin stories makes me feel weary, and the comic geek in me wants to just get on with it. But on the other hand, the DCEU's major problem was a lack of patience, and I get concerned that they may be repeating those same mistakes. As silly as it sounds, it feels like the hopes of this opening movie to the new DCU may well rest on the little shoulders of man's best friend. When I first saw Krypto come on my screen, I was like, what the hell? But you know, it could work. It's a gamble, but it could. Get this wrong, and you may end up with a cheesy movie with a mascot no one asked for. Get it right. You could have the next take on the unconventional family. Sorry, cat lovers. But the idea of our relationship with our pets? There could be the germ of an idea there. As it stands, we hold our breath and ask Krypto.
Home. Take me home.